Behind me is the rear courtyard of the Hôtel des Invalides on the south bank of the Seine River in Paris. Today, it houses the Musée de l'Armée, which is the Army Museum, as well as a massive crypt that contains the bones of Napoleon Bonaparte. But it was originally built as a home for aged and disabled veterans of the army of Louis XIV, Louis XIV in France, who ordered its construction in 1670. For our purposes, Les Invalides, as it's commonly called, is significant in two ways. First, it could only have been constructed by a monarch with complete control over his military forces, a control that certainly did not exist when European kings and princes fought the 30 Years' War. Second, it is a remarkable testament to the respect that Louis XIV held for his soldiers, um, a respect that in many armies of the 18th century was conspicuous by its absence. The France of Louis XIV was the first to create the institutions and policies that made a completely professional army possible, institutions and policies that other Europeans eventually adopted or adapted. Now, this is well known to historians and would have a prominent place in any military history course that focuses on the century explored in this course. But Les Invalides suggests something that is usually overlooked, the respect it showed for military veterans that we now take for granted, but which was unusual during the 18th century. Now, thank you for your service is something that American civilians say to veterans whenever they encounter them. A phrase, incidentally, about which many veterans are ambivalent. On the one hand, veterans appreciate the sentiment. On the other, they recognize all too well that these civilians have little idea of what they're actually thanking them for. The petty degradation of military service, the long separations from loved ones, the realities of combat, of which civilians have almost no conception, and the psychological wounds that are the results of that service, and that veterans carry them with them for years and often for the rest of their lives. We know that the ancient Athenians had some comprehension of these wounds. And it has been argued, I think convincingly, that many classical Greek plays were written not just about veterans of the wars of ancient Greece, but also for them as a way to acknowledge those wounds and to offer civilians a glimpse of their pain. Now, this week's module will focus on the rise of the professional armies and maritime power and the reasons, rule sets, and patterns of European warfare during this period. And we will focus largely on monarchs, military commanders, high ranking officials, and battles and sieges, especially sieges are important here. But I do not want you to lose sight of the fact that the so-called limited wars of the 18th century, the Ancien Regime, it's often called, were anything but limited to the soldiers and sailors who had to fight them. And by the way, anything but limited to the civilians who lived in the regions across which the armies of the Ancien Regime marched and fought.